Hello everyone and welcome to the first Patreon Q&A here on military aviation history. Now this video is made possible by the roughly 130 Patreons that support me on a monthly basis over Patreon. Now it is really your support, and indeed it matters more than you might think, that allows me to keep this channel going, and it, for example, allows me to buy books. These books here are recent acquisitions that have either already directly influenced videos or will directly influence certain videos in the near future. And it also allowed me to buy a new camera, which allows you to see me in proper quality. This camera will be really cool to take onto museums and field trips, because now I can finally show off all these great aircraft in the proper detail. Now, in the coming months, also due to the support of my Patreons, I will be going on some really amazing field trips, and I'm hoping that the content that we make there will provide some really good entertainment for you guys. Now, in any case, patrons are allowed to submit regular questions for a Q&A, and I've gotten quite a few of them here, so here we go. Now we're going to start this off by a really simple question here from Evan. Actually, it's not that simple of a question if I think about it. Couple of upvotes on that one as well. If you could personally own or fly any World War II era aircraft, fighter, bomber, etc., what would it be and why? I mean, the list goes on and on and on, right? But I do have a favorite, and it is not a plane that most of you guys will expect, I presume. Now, there's some really cool warbirds from World War II era. You have the Bf-109, you have the Spitfire, Focke-Wulf 190, Me-262, P-47, P-51, of course. Even a Zero would be fun to fly. Even when you go to Russia, you have an LA-5. That's a pretty cool aircraft. An I-16 interests me in a way. It's not an amazing aircraft, but actually it was really revolutionary when it was introduced. But to be honest, I'm not the kind of person that would really go for such a choice. I think eventually that would bore me. So I thought a bit more, and I tried to find some aircraft that I really would like to have that's a little bit out there, and that is not the favorite that I'm already thinking about. But I really didn't find one. I mean, you have, for example, the Fieseler Storch, which is also a really great aircraft. You have the Heinkel 123. Again, one of those aircraft that most people don't know about, but the Germans used them in Spain during the Civil War, and they still used them in 1944, 1945 on the Eastern Front. They couldn't get enough of those aircraft, Then you have the SBD Dauntless, also one of my favorites. The Focke-Wulf 189, which is also a really just beautiful aircraft in my opinion. Ju-52, I mean, I would like to own one, I guess, but anyway, you guys want to know what I would personally really want to fly. And there is a clear favorite, and there's a clear winner here, and that is a consolidated PBY Catalina. Yeah, it's a bit boring, I guess. Specifically, it would be the PBY 5A or 6A, because then I can land on water and on tarmac, on land. The reason why I like this aircraft is just because it's so versatile, and pretty much you can make a flying house out of it. It's pretty big, and during the war it regularly housed a crew of 10 doing these long kind of maritime patrols. It's not very fast, roughly 300 kilometers I think per hour. You could push it, that's like what, 210 miles per hour? But its range is just amazing for the aircraft that it is. I think the range was 400 kilometers, not 400, 4,000 kilometers. 2,500, 2,600 miles, which means that I could take off on the Atlantic coast of France and fly all the way to Washington, D.C. It would take a long time. I would need a co-pilot for it, but it would work, and I can land anywhere. And I just really like the Catalina. Of course, you can say, well, there's better aircraft. There's the Sunderland, there's the H6K, Dornier 18, Blohmen Voss 222 Viking. I'm partial to the Catalina. The looks is just amazing. And they're still using them today, by the way. They're still using them as anti-forest fire aircraft, or whatever you call them, firefighting aircraft. There we go. So yeah, the Catalina would be it, I think. Obviously, it's going to be expensive to maintain, but we can all dream. Now, Richard wants to know, in history books, one sometimes reads implied criticism of Luftwaffe force deployment in the late war period. Not just implied, Richard, not just implied. In particular, the relative weakness of forces deployed for tactical use on the Western Front after June 1944 and the failure to defend the Reich from strategic bombing. Could Luftwaffe resources have been deployed to better effect in 1943 to 1945? Thank you for considering the submissions. Of course, you're a patron. Of course, I'm considering the submission. I'm absolutely happy to answer it. So yeah, not just implied criticism. There's a lot of criticism to go around when it comes to what the Luftwaffe did, especially on the Western Front between 1943 and 1945. Can't go into all of it right now. But I think there's a clear weakness, and then you've mentioned it as well in your question, of close air support. The Germans could very rarely apply any kind of tactical close air support to their troops on the Western Front, especially what really destroyed the Luftwaffe in the West was Operation Bodenplatte. And that is where the Germans, they were building up reserves in a way that they didn't. They were building up reserves, and they tried to use those reserves, or the aim of those reserves was to wrestle back air superiority over Germany and just have a big force, suddenly deploy a very big force of a lot of fighters and just make the American bomber forces bleed out over a couple of weeks and months. That was the plan. And then all those planes and all those pilots were wasted on Operation Bodenplatte. And after that, it's done. Operation Bodenplatte was essentially the equivalent of shooting yourself in the foot, but you don't just shoot yourself in the right foot, you also shoot yourself in the left foot, and then you keep on shooting yourself in the calf. That was essentially Operation Bodenplatte for the Luftwaffe. So the planes were completely wasted, and there was no way to recover from that. Now, of course, the thing we also have to remember here is that the air war on the West and the Eastern Front is very different. In the West, the way that air superiority worked, of course, you have the escorts coming in with the bombers, and the Germans take off and fight those. But then in the late war, the Americans and the Brits, they would just fly over German territory looking for trouble, and they would sometimes find it. Not that often, because there's not a lot of German left. But then at that point, the Allies had air superiority over the Reich. On the Eastern Front, however, it's a lot about local air superiority. And this is why you sometimes wonder, how did the Germans still locally on the Eastern Front maintain air superiority, even if it's just for an hour or two, even less sometimes, just 20 minutes, just go in, defeat what's there in the air, hit the ground, go out. That is not possible in the West. So a lot of people that see maybe the efforts that the Luftwaffe had in the East, which by 1945, there wasn't much they could do anyway. But 1944, there was still some local success. At 1943, especially with the Battle of Prokhorovka, the Germans did actually reasonably well in parts with the resources that they had. Operation Bodenplatte killed the Luftwaffe in the West. And after that, there was very little they could have done. It was just a big mistake. Now, Hansaplast wants to know. I will ask you same question as before. Okay. I watched your Night Fighter video and I liked it. Thank you very much. Glad you enjoyed it. But I would like to know more about their equipment, antennas, for example, and how did they use them. I also thought that there was a version of the Bf-110 and the Ju-88 made for night fighting. Yes, indeed. How did the Germans organize air defense from the beginning and until the end of World War II on West and East? How did Japan organize air defense from the beginning and until the end of World War II? And what was the survival rate of the fighter plane? Did bomber crews have more of a chance? Wow, we have to unwrap a lot of it. Okay, so the first video you mentioned here, Hansaplast, if you guys don't know, this is my Wilde Sau video. So it's a video about German pilots that were sent up at night in single-engine aircraft with very little night-flying equipment, and they were supposed to find British bombers in particular just by Mark I eyeball. And sometimes they had some cooperation with the flag would light it up, or they would shoot flares into the sky, and sometimes even a burning city would illuminate the sky so much that they could find these bombers. But it was very much a mixed bag. If you want to know more about it, just watch the video. However, these night fighters are not to be confused with real night fighters. So let's say Bf-110s or Ju-88s that were specifically built for the role of a night fighter, because the Wilde Sau pilots didn't have planes that were specifically built for that. And yes, you might have heard that their motorcycle just went by. But yeah, Bf-110s and Ju-88s were used for night fighting, amongst others, and I will probably make a video about that at one point. Now, air defense in the West was mainly flak, and obviously fighters. We already alluded a little bit of what happened after Operation Bodenplatte, but it was very different to the East, yeah? For example, one of the things you might want to look into if you want to know more about it is just Google Kammhuber-Linie. Yeah? That's also pre-Wilde Sau, and then afterwards they kind of changed the way they organized the air defense at night. And for example, one of the things they did with these night fighters is they had dedicated boxes. Or just imagine a map, and you draw little boxes, and 1 or 2 night fighters would operate in each single box. And once the ground radar notices bombers coming in, they look, okay, what's the course? Okay, let's track these guys. Okay, they're going to hit this box right here. Let's radio pilot A and pilot B that are operating in that box and tell them that the enemy aircraft are coming, and then we're going to guide them in towards those enemy aircraft. And once they're close enough, the onboard radar systems that they had, especially in 44 and 45, will actually also in 43 already a little bit, will be able to track these aircraft alone. Because you got to remember, the radar that was on these aircraft was relatively short range. So you had somebody from ground personnel telling them, okay, turn now 90 degrees, nose down, bomber is 10 kilometers in front of you. And then he would just go that way, and the radio operator continue. Do you have him? No, you don't have him yet. Okay, continue. Make a slight course adjustment to left. Let's say, well, let's go course something. Do you have him now? Okay, perfect. And then he just talks to somebody else, or he looks for more people. So that's one of the ways that they would, for example, do it. Now in the East, as with the question before, essentially the Luftwaffe was a firefighting force. They were constantly running from A to B, and then to C, and then to D, and then back to A. And it was all, of course, done at low altitudes. And the Soviets did very little strategic bombing. Most of the stuff they hit was within 10 kilometers of the front line. Even interdiction was very rare when the Soviets came. So the Germans, they just had to go, they had to take off, run to one point, land, refuel, rearm, get a bite to eat, fly to the next part, and so on. It was very, very intense at that kind of warfare. And that is why you don't really have air superiority on the Eastern Front, because all the fighting was always in different areas, and you would have air superiority, temporary local air superiority, but you would never have this grand overarching air superiority. Although by 1944, you can make an argument that the Soviets had air superiority. You can make that argument. Okay, Japan. I don't know much about Japan's air defense of the home island. Now, in the beginning of the war, especially after Pearl Harbor, they had very little. They had very little homeland defense because they didn't expect the Americans to come. And the Doolittle raid kind of showed them that they were wrong. Now, the Doolittle raid, we can talk about the actual impact of that raid. But what it did do is it made the Japanese think twice about their air defense, and it did change some of their thinking in that regard, and they pulled back a couple of fighters from the front lines and so on. In the beginning, and also in mid-war, the Japanese lacked a lot of, for example, aircraft that were very good at high altitudes, where the Americans would eventually be coming in with their bombers. And that changed in the late war. But by the late war period, they didn't have enough of those planes that were good at high altitude, and they also didn't have enough pilots, especially trained pilots. And at that point, what can you do? Okay, so for the fourth question, remind me again, what was it? Was the survival rate of the fighter plane? Did bomber crews have more of a chance? Okay, so the percentage depends on the time frame, the nation, and the context. Yeah, German fighter pilots, or German any pilot, very low survival rate. The Western Allies, relatively high survival rate compared to the Germans, also because they rotated pilots. And they rested pilots more than the Germans. The Germans rarely ever rested the pilot. The only point when a German pilot would have any sort of rest is when he's either wounded or when he's sent back to Berlin to receive the Knight's Cross or something. Those are the only two reasons why a German pilot would ever get a break. Or if they didn't have any planes, then obviously he had a break. But yeah, it really depends. And the Soviets had also a lot of casualties in the beginning, later on a little bit less. So yeah, it depends. The Japanese also bled out really badly. But what you can, for example, look is at pre-long-range escort B-17 losses and post escort, or like post-introduction of long-range escort aircraft, so specifically the P-51. And you will see a difference there. But you also have to take into account the Luftwaffe strength at the time. Okay, moving on to Scott. Also a couple of upvotes here. A question of research. Having just finished reading Jagdverband 44, Squadron of Experten, there are an account of an engagement between Me-262s and B-26s. The account retells this from both sides. Just wondering in your research how often there are reliable first-hand accounts from both sides of an action. As well, do you ever come across any of these accounts with little to no exaggerations? Having the exact same tactical engagement described by both sides that contributed to it is rare. Is actually quite rare. Mostly because that would take an insane amount of time to correlate. So, you know, for example, an American historian would have to go to their own archives, look through them, then look through the German documents that they have to see if there is any correlation between those, you know, if let's say on the 1st of March 1943, American documents he has, does he find German documents? No. And then he has to go to Germany, to the archives there that still exist, and look through there. And then again, most of the German archives, archive material was burned. So it's very rare, for example, to do those reasons, to find anything that helps us describe a certain battle or an engagement between the Western Allies and the Germans. You do find it, for example, sometimes for the Battle of Britain. Some of the aces, the German aces that survived, they describe what happened on certain days, and then the Brits would describe it as well, and so on. So you do find it occasionally, but to really find a lot with a lot of detail and stuff that also corresponds to each other is very rare. And this is actually quite interesting because especially during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of historians in Britain, also in Germany, and in America were basing everything they wrote about World War II, especially the air part, on their own archive material. And especially when it comes to kill claims, they were woefully wrong. And this only emerged in the 90s and then later on now, and after the pass of the millennia, where historians would make cross-nation studies. So they would study their own material, and then they go to the archives in another country and study their material. And then they would realize, whoa, okay, so on that day when we claimed, let's say, 30 aircraft destroyed, actually they only lost 20. Or actually, no, that would actually even be a good ratio. Let's say they claimed 30 and the actual amount of destroyed aircraft was 5. That happened. So yeah, it's something just that, you know, it's history. It's hard to validate all of this stuff. So I hope that answered your question. Actually, I think there was a second part there. Do you ever come across any of these accounts with little or no exaggeration? Happens. But simply out of the nature of things, how pilots perceive an aerial engagement, without wanting to lie, without doing it on purpose, they will claim, for example, more kills than they actually made, just because they think they made those kills, but they didn't. It's just, you have so many of these cases where, you know, and a whole squadron would, as I said, claim a certain amount of kills, and then later on it turned out actually they only had a fraction of that. It's just the nature of things. Right, Simon wants to know, do you plan to release a video about the Heinkel 280, and why it was not selected as the first jet fighter, Luftwaffe jet fighter? Do you think it would be possible to make a video about the evolution of aircraft camouflage in Germany during the 1939 and 1945 period? Yes. By the way, we do have merchandise now, so if you're interested in getting some sweet merch, check out the link down below. I also try to put a link up here. So yeah, we have the first merchandising, and if you like the design, not bad at all. Check it out. Okay, so the question was about the Heinkel 280. Yes, I will make a video about the Heinkel 280. This is why I don't want to spoil too much right now. The second question, camouflage in Germany. Yes, and it is also a big yes, because it is part of a promise that I still have to fulfill to one of my buddies, who I have promised this a long time ago. So yes, it will be made. Okay, Jonas wants to know. He would like to know if I would do a video about the evolution of military air power theory. I know your channel focuses on the practical aspect of air warfare, but I think that the evolution of the role of air power in theoretical terms. Looking forward to your new X videos. Cheers. Yes, the idea is there. The problem is finding the right balance between depth and comprehension for the average viewer. This is a problem that I often run into, and I want to provide as much information as possible, but I also have to take into account comprehension. And the more data I give to people, and as much theory as I give to people, the more input there is essentially, and the more they shut off. That's just simply what happens. If you watch any video that is about, that shows a lot of data, or that where you really have to think with the video, at some point you just shut off. It's I have it as well. And for a video like this, when we talk about the evolution, where we have to take a lot of things into account, I think that the videos that I kind of make, I have to make a little bit of a change. Maybe I'll do it like a vlog-like video like this, where I have certain cut-ins of pictures and so on, and then I just talk to the camera. Maybe that's a better way of doing it, and then just going through it. Also, it's a huge topic. We could go back to the Napoleonic age and beyond. If you want to talk about air power, obviously, we can shorten that into a minute. But it's an interesting topic. I sometimes also wonder, does this interest anybody? And obviously, a lot of you guys will be interested. But is this interesting to the average viewer? Probably not. And I have to take those things into account. What I could be doing, for example, is also a video per major nation. I did this, for example, with the RAF strategic bombing video, where I talked about how the RAF became very much focused on strategic bombing. That's an option. Also with the Swedish dive bombers, kind of touched upon it. Okay, Trumpeteer wants to know, was there any particular advantage between the water-cooled designs of the Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190D Dora and Ta 152? I only ask as the Doras and the 152s look very much like radial engine designs, which are noted for becoming aerodynamically inefficient. Also, why could Germany into four-bladed propellers for their fighters? Okay, so one of the things you have to take into account when you talk about engine, the usage of certain engines is, are those engines available? Why did the Germans, for example, use a radial engine on the Focke-Wulf 190? Well, there's good reasons for that, but good reasons beyond what I'm going to tell you. But one of the reasons is also because at that point they could reserve the Daimler-Benz engines for the 109s, and they had a different engine for the Focke-Wulfs. I mean, we can talk about the whole logistical aspects about this. We can talk about, for example, the Americans standardized their engines really well, with their Pratt & Whitneys. There is a very good explanation for that as well, why they used the Pratt & Whitney. First of all, it's a really powerful engine, and then they could build a lot of them. Now, when it comes to aerodynamically efficiency or inefficiency, now radial engines are not necessarily aerodynamically inefficient. Everybody thinks pointy nose means speed. Yes, but radial engines are not automatically a bad thing in that regard. I have to do a lot more reading when it comes to aerodynamic stuff, so I can't give you a definite answer on this right now, but I know from the past when I had some contact with aeronautical engineers and so on, they said, you know what, radial engine is not that bad when it comes to aerodynamics. So I'm sitting there, okay, that's, you're the boss. I can only tell you and relate what they told you. And four-bladed propellers, I have no idea, I have to check. Okay, so Russell wants to know, my grandfather curved old World War I and World War II planes. He loved them so much and he wanted to be a mechanic on them when he was in the US Army serving in Korea. It definitely wore off on me and I love them because of him. Who, what and where did your passion come from? I know you probably answered this, but just in case, I'm curious. Thank you. I answered this a long time ago. Don't worry about it. Must have still been 2013, 2014 or something. Essentially what happened is that we had a friend of the family and a neighbor as well who had a small plane. It was a Tampico, I think, single engine, four seats. And when I was a young boy, he would sometimes take me with him on a small flight. We'd fly around an hour or something, land on a different airfield, have dinner there, or lunch actually, and fly back. And that's how I got exposed to aviation. And then he also had a lot of books on them. And all those books, by the way, were French, because he was French, or Wallonian actually. And I didn't understand a word of it. But, there's beautiful pictures, and you do understand. If you really concentrate a little bit, if you ask a couple of questions, you understand. And he also had Combat Flight Simulator. So he had Microsoft Combat Flight Simulator 2, or was it 98? No, I think it was 2. So long ago. And I played that a lot, which, maybe not the best flight simulator out there, but it did the trick on me. And then later on IL-2. 1946, and I spent a lot of time with those games. Oh yes, yeah. And then when I was a teenager, World War II aircraft, it wasn't exactly a cool thing, so my interest waned a little bit. And then once I was out of high school, it very quickly resurfaced, and I was back in action. I started buying books, and then I made a channel, and now I'm here. Okay. I hope that answered your question. And then Mensch wants to know, I think this is the last question. It seems as though France was behind Germany and Britain in terms of aviation designs in 1940. Do you think this could have been fixed had France not been steamrolled in 1940? In other words, were there any planes on the drawing board or in prototypes that had a real promise when the armistice came? France gets a bad reputation. Deserved in parts. But they were not necessarily behind. They got out of World War I with arguably the strongest and best air force. They had produced, I don't know how many machines. They produced more than the Brits. In fact, the Brits used French machines. I think they also used French engines during World War I. Pretty much the whole American air service was equipped with French aircraft. The Liberty engine that the Americans produced in high number, I think they produced like 10,000 of those, wasn't really suited to the aircraft designs at the time, or there was no aircraft design, or fighter design at least, that was really suited to be equipped with a Liberty engine. So they produced a lot of these engines, but then they ended up not using them in most of their fighters. So France was really good in 1918, 1919 and so on. They were really set up to dominate the aerial domain. And over the interwar years, that continues for most of the time. They make advances pretty much everywhere. They make advances in turrets, in turret design. They make advances in aeronautical designs. They make advances in weaponry. They make advances in engines. You name it, they do it. They even experiment with jet engines in the 30s. The problem with the French is that there is too much of everything. There's too much people, like too many cooks ruining the pie, and there's too much individual experimentation and not really state-sponsored experimentation. So you have a lot of these companies in France that coming up with these really advanced designs, and the French state just, isn't interested. They, for some reason, you can look at the French politics in the 1920s, 1930s. The ministers change. There's every month there's a new minister or something, and that obviously translates into a problem because the minister A does certain things, and then minister B comes in and he's like, no. We do not do this, we do something else. And then Minister B changes everything Minister A did, and then he gets sacked, and then Minister C comes in, and what does he do? He does no. This is what happened. And the poor French Air Force, which for a long time wasn't independent, suffered accordingly. And a lot of the advances that the French made in the aerial domain was really successful in the export market. So for example, the Brits really liked French turrets. They realized in the 1930s that their own turret designs were not up to par. They went to France, they saw all these amazing turrets that the French had built, like power operated, like electric operated and so on. And they were like, oh, this is great. And they buy these licenses from these companies that are struggling for survival, on the verge of bankruptcy, and they buy these licenses for cheap, really for cheap. And the French don't use their own licenses, they don't use their own things, but the RAF comes in and buys all the stuff. So that's one of the reasons. And also they had too many planes. They had their own domestic designs, which were probably somewhat outdated. We're talking about, the Devatine, I think it's called, D520. I never know how to pronounce it. Some people say it's on par with the Bf 109 Emil. It's probably a little bit inferior. But a lot of it depends on the pilots. And the French actually had some good pilots. But again, even though they had good pilots, they had too many aircraft, which is a problem when it comes to logistics alone. And they had too few of the many aircraft designs that they put into service. So they never had enough. And then on top of that, they imported a lot of planes. So they imported, for example, American P-36s, which became the Hawk or the H-75s. And they required a lot of extensive modifications to be made on those planes. The same thing with the Havocs. So they came in lower numbers because the Americans just couldn't, produce their own standard Hawk or Havoc. No, they had to rip out some stuff and had to retrofit French equipment into it and so on. French intricacies, for example, instead of throttling up by pushing forward on the throttle, you throttle up by pulling on the stick. All these little things didn't help. And then there's the tactical application of the Air Force that was completely wrong. And they were behind in their thinking in that regard. And again, it's not the pilot's fault. The pilots actually, here's the thing. The Luftwaffe, during the invasion of France and until the capitulation of France, the Luftwaffe starts the Battle of France with roughly, 2,200 or 2,500 aircraft. They lose about 30 to 40% of them. And this is down in no small part to the French. The RAF was in the Battle of France for some time, but not for long. The French are the ones that inflict those losses. And if you think about it, the Battle of France, the numerical strength that the Luftwaffe had at the opening of Battle of France is the highest operational strength they will ever have during World War II. Even going into Russia during Operation Barbarossa, they don't have nearly the amount of planes that they have operational for during the Battle of France. So you could say that the French, with the losses they inflicted, did a really good service to the Allies, in fact, by not just bending over, as many people say, and inflicting some serious losses, because the Germans would never recover. And the Battle of Britain, for example, if the Germans would have had the same amount of planes for the Battle of Britain than they had for the Battle of France, that would have been pretty bad for the RAF. But they didn't. They had tired pilots, tired machines. They had lost a lot of their machines. They had lost a lot of their pilots. And they were immediately put into the Battle of Britain. So the RAF can say thank you to the French for that. One thing I also want to say about the French before I end this. At the later stage during the Battle of France, especially when the Germans do Operation Paula, so this is just after the Battle of Dunkirk, or the evacuation of Dunkirk, they want to go in and destroy all the remaining French aircraft. In 2 or 3 days, they want to pulverize the French Air Force. No machine is supposed to be still flying with French colors. The French see it coming. And what do? They disperse their airfields, their air crews, and they do some really nifty stuff. They camouflage, they build up mock aircraft and so on, and the Germans hit all the wrong targets. The bombings of the airfields around Paris, for example, that the Germans conducted. The Germans thought, oh, we destroyed those guys. And then they realized, wait a minute, we bombed absolutely nothing. There was nothing on those airfields except wood, plywood, or canvas. So you know, French Air Force did relatively well, all things considered. They were let down by, I think, in my opinion, by their politics in the 1930s. They were let down in parts by the military and the tactical applications, but the pilots themselves did relatively well. And they learned lessons quite fast, which is also something that everybody keeps forgetting. The French learned lessons very quickly. It's just that once they learned the lessons, they didn't have the necessary equipment and the pilots and the planes, and also the cohesion to do anything with that knowledge. But anyway, that's enough for that. I hope you guys enjoyed those questions. I really enjoyed actually talking about some of these. I could go on and on and on, so I apologize if I have been a little bit rambly. Now, if you do want to support me on Patreon, thank you very much. Just giving me a buck or two a month does a great deal in helping me maintain the channel. For the next Q&A, you will also be able to submit your questions. And I hope all of you have a great day, good hunting, and see you in the sky. Cheers. It's such a hard